Welcome to Tetratypes In Depth, a series for longer, source-led explorations of the people and ideas that shaped socionics. This episode turns to Viktor Gulenko and Model G, one of the most influential attempts to move beyond a purely informational description of type. The question is simple. If a sociotype tells us how a person processes information, can it also tell us how they mobilise effort, sustain activity, respond to pressure, and become visible in interaction? Gulenko's answer was an energy model of the psyche. He did not present it as a rejection of Augusta's Model A. He argued that information and energy have to be considered together. We will begin with Gulenko himself, then ask why he introduced this model, how its 4 blocks work, and what it means in practice. One sociotype will accompany us throughout: the logical-intuitive introvert, the type with which Gulenko identifies himself. At the end, we will briefly distinguish Model G from the related system of dominant, creative, normalising, and harmonising subtypes. Viktor Gulenko was born in 1958 and graduated from Kyiv University in 1982 with a degree in Romance and Germanic philology. His own account places his socionics experience from 1985 in the early period after Augusta's work began circulating more widely. His route into the field was personal as well as intellectual. Gulenko wrote that he was drawn by the wish to know what was unknown. He also connected his interest with difficulties of communication, which he described as a major obstacle to self-realisation for a logical introvert. He went on to found the School of Humanitarian Socionics in Kyiv. Its work developed its own terminology, methods of diagnosis, descriptions of interaction, and eventually the energetic framework known as Model G. Gulenko was not simply adding another diagram to an already complete theory. He was trying to make socionics speak to lived activity: what people do, how they affect a group, and why the same information processing may appear vigorous, restrained, persuasive, defensive, or exhausted in real life. Why did Gulenko think an energy model was needed? Model A gives socionics a language for information metabolism. It asks which kinds of information are processed confidently, which are valued, and which create difficulty. But Gulenko argued that information, by itself, does not explain enough about action. A sound idea may remain unused. A message may be correct and still fail to move a person or a group. Knowledge needs the energy to become activity. His concern was therefore not only what a person notices or understands, it was how the psyche converts potential into action. Why does someone confidently take up one task, perform another only when required, become vivid in private, or lose effectiveness when too much effort is demanded? This is why the word energy appears. It does not mean a measurable physical substance, and it does not turn socionics into neuroscience. It is Gulenko's theoretical vocabulary for the intensity, direction, economy, and transformation of psychological activity. The model should be understood on those terms, as a proposal within humanitarian socionics. In Model G, a sociotype is described as transforming energy qualitatively while interacting with the world. The theory is not simply saying that one person has more energy than another. It proposes that activity is mobilised, stabilised, displayed, or depleted in different ways. A person may be capable in one sphere, carefully adaptive in another, unexpectedly expressive in a familiar setting, and inefficient under a different kind of pressure. Gulenko combines this energetic picture with information metabolism. The two are meant to be complementary. Model A remains a language for information. Model G adds a language for the energetic organization of activity. This explains a frequent source of confusion. Model G is not Model A with its familiar positions renamed. Gulenko's school treats it as a different arrangement. Trying to translate every position directly from one diagram into the other can distort what the energy model is saying. So the aim is not to memorize a code, it is to see how Gulenko maps the movement from potential to action, to adaptation, to strain. Model G contains 8 functions arranged in 4 blocks. Each block describes a different setting and style of activity. First is the block of social mission, the strongest outward block, through which a person can regularly meet complex demands at a wider social distance. Second is social adaptation. This is also outward-facing, but concerns learned adjustment to established expectations and recurring tasks. Third is creative self-realisation. Here, activity is personal and closer to home. It is where a person may show something distinctive, spontaneous, or provocative in a familiar territory. Fourth is the block of inflation. Gulenko uses this striking word for the least economical area of the system. Effort can expand while effectiveness falls, eventually leading to depletion. The 4 blocks are not moral rankings, social adaptation is not failure, and creative self-realization is not an inferior mission. They describe different conditions, broad public action, regular adjustment, private self-assertion, and costly strain. We can now look more closely at the 2 blocks concerned with visible contact with society. The social mission block contains a leading function and a creative function. In Gulenko's account, it is the most powerful part of the model, supporting sustained action at a wider communicative distance. The leading function makes decisions and directs resources. The creative function adapts the mission to local conditions. Together, they describe how a sociotype can repeatedly address demanding tasks in society. The next block is social adaptation. It contains the role-playing function and the launching function. This block is trained by social norms. It helps a person handle familiar, regular demands, but does not have the same spontaneous authority as social mission. The role-playing function can be consciously developed for public expectations. Its activity falls away when the external demand disappears. The launching function supplies an impulse that starts action under suitable conditions. An ability may be visible and competent without being the person's central mission. Model G asks us to notice not only what someone can do, but when, for whom, and at what energetic cost. The 2 inward blocks complete the picture. Creative self-realization contains the demonstrative function and the manipulative function. Gulenko places this block at a closer communicative distance, among familiar people, or in a setting that feels personally owned. The demonstrative function can emerge suddenly and attract attention. The manipulative function is associated with stored habits, long-term adjustment, and the replenishing or smoothing of activity. Here, a person may solve unusual problems with flair, but not necessarily in a way that can be maintained as a public obligation. The final block is inflation. It contains the braking function and the controlling function. This is the model's weakest and most effort-intensive area. Gulenko compares its dynamic to inflating a bubble. More and more energy is spent until the system is overwhelmed and the energy is released. The braking function inhibits action and resists workload. The controlling function attempts to impose limits on the immediate environment, even where sustained effective action is difficult. Pressure, then, does not always produce greater output. Sometimes it produces expenditure, resistance, and eventual exhaustion. We can now introduce our recurring example, the logical-intuitive introvert. This is appropriate because Viktor Gulenko describes himself as a logical introvert. But the example is not a portrait of Gulenko as an individual, and it is not a claim that every logical intuitive introvert behaves alike. It is a way of making an abstract model easier to follow. In familiar information metabolism language, this type is associated with structural logic and intuition of possibilities. Its description often emphasizes analysis, conceptual precision, coherent systems, and interest in possible explanations. That can be useful. Yet it does not answer every practical question. Does the person work best under public responsibility or in a protected setting? Why might two people of the same type look different at work? Model G approaches such questions through a different ordering of functions and blocks. Every sociotype in the model has all 4 blocks: social mission, social adaptation, creative self-realisation, and inflation. The task is therefore not to place a type into one block. It is to ask how the functions of that type are arranged across all 4 blocks, and how their energy is understood in each setting. What does Model G add to the example of the logical-intuitive introvert? It allows us to ask 4 connected questions. At a wider social distance, what contribution can this type make to a demanding public task? In social adaptation, how might it handle regular expectations and learned roles? At close range, where may it become more distinctive or unexpectedly expressive? And under what kinds of pressure might effort become inefficient? This is Model G's account, not a direct translation of the familiar Model A arrangement. The positions are differently ordered, and Gulenko warns against treating the 2 models as if one could be mechanically converted into the other. Imagine someone who clarifies definitions, identifies a missing distinction, or improves a method. Model A describes the information involved. Model G asks when that work becomes active, visible, and draining. The energy model shifts the focus from a list of traits to a pattern of engagement across all 4 blocks: public responsibility, learned adaptation, close self-expression, and the point at which effort becomes inefficient. Consider a practical situation. A team is trying to solve a recurring problem. Its members have plenty of opinions, but no agreed terms, no orderly process, and no way to test whether the proposed solution is coherent. The logical-intuitive introvert may become useful here by separating questions that have been muddled together, defining the issue, and showing which possibilities follow from which assumptions. The contribution is not merely an interest in theory. In Gulenko's framework, it is an energetic pattern of adaptation to a real social task. But Model G also asks us to look at distance and pressure. A regular bounded request may invite effective participation. An excessive demand for immediate emotional display, permanent control of others, or effort in an unsuitable area may produce resistance, inhibition, or disproportionate fatigue. This is why the model is not well reduced to the sentence, "This type has a lot of energy," or "This type has little energy." Its claim is more specific. Energy is allocated differently across functions, blocks, distances, and circumstances. The same person can look composed in one context, unexpectedly vivid in another, and depleted in a third. Without their sociotype changing. Gulenko gives this pattern a more detailed energetic scale. The leading and demonstrative functions are energy maximum functions. They receive the largest share of the system's energy. The creative and manipulative functions are energy optimal. They receive what is needed to solve the task at hand. The role-playing and breaking functions are energy minimum. The launching and controlling functions are energy pessimum. They are associated with remaining energy and become especially significant in extreme circumstances. The purpose is practical. The scale distinguishes robust activity from economical activity, trained but limited activity, and activity that is costly or unstable. For our logical-intuitive introvert example, this cautions us against a flat stereotype of the quiet analyst. The energy model asks where an analytical contribution can be sustained, where it is situational, where it becomes personally demonstrative, and where pressure creates diminishing returns. It also gives a reason why observation matters to humanitarian socionics. A type cannot be inferred from one dramatic moment. The observer must notice patterns across time, social distance, task demands, and the changing economy of effort. Before we close, we need to distinguish Model G from another major part of Gulenko's wider system, the subtype model of dominant, creative, normalising, and harmonising. These four labels describe variations in the visible style of a person of the same sociotype. A dominant variant may appear forceful, directive, and mobilising. A creative variant may appear exploratory, expressive, and change-oriented. A normalising variant may appear methodical, regulating, and attentive to standards. A harmonising variant may appear accommodating, receptive, and concerned with balance. Applied to the logical-intuitive introvert, the subtype idea helps explain why two people with the same underlying sociotype might present very differently. One may take charge of a conceptual project, another may generate unusual alternatives, another may refine procedures, another may prefer a quieter, more conciliatory intellectual role. But this is a separate explanatory layer. Model G concerns the energetic structure and dynamics of the sociotype. The subtype system concerns variation in its expression. They belong to the same humanitarian socionics tradition, but they should not be collapsed into one theory. Viktor Gulenko's Model G is an attempt to answer a practical question left open by a purely informational account of type. How does a sociotype become active in the world? His answer is not that people are fixed quantities of energy. It is that activity has an organization. Some forms of action support a public mission. Some support adaptation to regular demands. Some emerge most vividly at close range. Some consume effort faster than they produce results. Following the logical-intuitive introvert has given us one route through that idea. The example began with structural logic and intuition of possibilities, but Model G moved beyond a description of interests. It asked about the conditions under which analysis becomes useful action, visible contribution, personal self-expression, or strain. That is why Gulenko calls Model G an energetic model, and why he presents it as a complement to Model A rather than a cancellation of it. The framework remains a proposal within socionics, not an established scientific account of human energy. Yet historically, it is one of the most ambitious efforts to connect type theory with work, interaction, pressure, and social life. Model G leaves us with a useful question. Not only what kind of information a person processes, but how that person turns potential into action.